Imagine an entire settlement suddenly silenced. No blood, no bodies, no signs of struggle. Only a single word carved into a wooden post: Croatoan. In 1587, more than 100 men, women, and children arrived on the distant shores of the New World, carrying hope for a new beginning. 3 years later, they were gone. No graves were found. No survivors were seen. It was as if the colony had simply faded into the wilderness. Tonight, we walk the quiet shores of Roanoke to uncover the mystery of the ghost colony America never forgot. Chapter 1. The Promise of Virginia. In the late summer of 1587, 3 small English ships approached the distant shores of the New World. After weeks at sea, the passengers gathered along the decks, watching the unfamiliar coastline slowly take shape through the morning mist. Before them lay Roanoke Island, a narrow stretch of land surrounded by quiet waters and endless forests. To the settlers, it was a place filled with uncertainty, but also with promise. There were 117 colonists in the expedition, men, women, and children. Families who had crossed the Atlantic Ocean in search of a new beginning. Unlike earlier voyages, this was not meant to be a temporary outpost or a military station. This time, the English intended to build a permanent home. They called their future colony Virginia, in honor of Queen Elizabeth I, who had encouraged England's dream of expansion across the ocean. When the settlers stepped onto the sandy shores of Roanoke Island, they entered a world unlike anything they had known in England. Tall trees pressed close together in dense forests, their branches whispering in the coastal wind. Strange birds called from the shadows, and the humid air carried unfamiliar scents of earth and salt water. Beyond the shoreline stretched a wilderness that seemed endless. At first, there was excitement and determination. The colonists began repairing the remains of an earlier settlement that had been abandoned only a year before. They raised wooden houses and storehouses, cleared small patches of land for crops, and worked to establish the fragile beginnings of a new community. Each day brought the promise that this distant outpost might one day grow into a thriving English town. Yet beneath that hope lay quiet uncertainty. The land was unfamiliar, and survival depended on resources that were often scarce. Food supplies ran low sooner than expected, and the settlers struggled to grow crops in soil they did not fully understand. The surrounding forests, beautiful in the daylight, felt vast and unknowable as evening approached. Still, life continued. On August 18, 1587, a child was born in the colony, a granddaughter of Governor John White. The baby was named Virginia Dare, and her birth marked a moment of quiet celebration among the settlers. She became the first English child born in the New World, a symbol of the future the colonists hoped to build. In a land filled with uncertainty, the arrival of new life felt like a sign that their efforts might endure. For a brief time, the colony seemed filled with possibility. Families worked side by side, children played among the wooden houses, and the settlers looked toward the future with cautious optimism. They believed that with patience and perseverance, Virginia might become a permanent English home across the sea. But beyond the edge of the settlement, the wilderness remained silent and watchful. Each night, as darkness settled over Roanoke Island, the colonists listened to the unfamiliar sounds drifting in from the forest, reminders that they were far from England and very much alone in a vast and unknown world. The promise of Virginia had begun, but its future remained uncertain. Chapter 2. The Long Goodbye. As the weeks passed on Roanoke Island, the early excitement of the settlement slowly gave way to growing concern. The supplies brought from England, once carefully stored in wooden chests and barrels, began to run dangerously low. Flour was rationed, salted meat became scarce. Even simple tools and clothing started to wear thin under the harsh conditions of the new land. The colonists had hoped that the surrounding environment would sustain them, but survival proved more difficult than expected. The soil did not always yield good harvests, and hunting was uncertain. Some days the settlers worked from sunrise until dusk, clearing land and planting crops, yet the results were never guaranteed. With each passing week, it became clearer that the colony could not survive without fresh supplies from England. The settlers turned to their governor, John White, for guidance. White had led the expedition across the Atlantic and carried the responsibility for the colony's future. After many discussions, a difficult decision was made. Someone would have to sail back to England and return with food, tools, and new settlers. The journey would be long and dangerous, but without it, the colony might not survive the coming seasons. There was little doubt about who must go. As governor, White felt it was his duty to make the journey himself. The decision weighed heavily on him. Among the colonists were his daughter, Eleanor Dare, and his newborn granddaughter, Virginia Dare. Leaving the settlement meant leaving his family behind in a land that still felt uncertain and fragile. He understood the risks they would face in his absence, yet he also knew that staying would offer them no better chance of survival. In late August of 1587, preparations began for his departure. The settlers gathered what little remained of their supplies to support the journey. The small ship that would carry White back across the Atlantic waited offshore, its sails shifting gently in the coastal wind. The day of departure arrived quietly. White walked along the sandy shore with his daughter and granddaughter, knowing that this might be the last time he would see them for many months. He promised Eleanor that he would return as quickly as possible, bringing everything the colony needed. The settlers shared the same hope, that his absence would be brief and that relief would soon arrive. Before boarding the ship, White agreed on a simple plan with the colonists. If the settlement was forced to move before he returned, they would carve the name of their destination into a tree or a wooden post. If they faced danger, they would add a cross beside the message. It was meant to be a clear signal, a way to guide him back to his people. Then the moment came to leave. White boarded the ship and watched as the shoreline slowly drifted away. The figures of the settlers grew smaller until they were only shapes against the pale sand and dark trees. Somewhere among them stood his daughter and granddaughter, waiting and watching as the ship carried him farther from the colony. He believed he would return within months. But beyond the horizon, events were already unfolding that would keep him away far longer than anyone could have imagined. The long goodbye had begun, and the fate of the colony was now left to time and uncertainty. Chapter 3. The World at War. When Governor John White left Roanoke Island in 1587, he believed his journey back to England would be brief. His plan was simple: gather supplies, organize another expedition, and return to the colony as quickly as possible. The settlers expected him back within a few months, and White himself held tightly to that promise as his ship crossed the Atlantic. But when he arrived in England, he found a country preparing for war. Across the Channel, Spain was assembling a vast naval force, a fleet that would soon be known as the Spanish Armada. England and Spain had been rivals for years, but now open conflict seemed unavoidable. Rumors of invasion spread through towns and ports. Soldiers were called into service, and ships were gathered for the defense of the kingdom. White tried immediately to organize a return voyage to Virginia. He spoke with merchants and ship owners, searching for any vessel willing to make the long journey across the ocean. But ships were no longer easily available. Nearly every seaworthy vessel had been claimed for the war effort. The Crown needed ships for defense, and private voyages were pushed aside. Soon, an official order made matters worse. Queen Elizabeth forbade most ships from leaving English waters. The country needed every available vessel ready in case the Spanish fleet appeared along the coast. Trade slowed, travel stopped, and overseas expeditions were postponed indefinitely. White found himself trapped. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Each passing season brought new delays and new disappointments. He searched for any opportunity to sail, but none came. The war dominated every aspect of life in England, leaving little room for distant colonies across the ocean. In the summer of 1588, the long-expected invasion finally began. The Spanish Armada sailed toward England with hundreds of ships, filling the channel with sails and cannon smoke. English forces rushed to meet them. Along the southern coast, people watched anxiously as news of battles spread from port to port. The thunder of naval cannons echoed across the water as English ships fought to defend their shores. Fireships drifted into the Spanish fleet, and fierce storms scattered the Armada as it retreated northward. England survived the invasion, but the struggle left the nation exhausted and its resources stretched thin. Throughout these desperate months, White could do little but wait. While England fought for survival, the small colony at Roanoke remained far beyond reach. Somewhere across the ocean, his daughter and granddaughter lived in uncertain conditions, still expecting his return. The contrast could not have been greater. In England, harbors were filled with ships and soldiers, and the air carried the sounds of preparation and conflict. In Roanoke, the settlers waited in silence, surrounded by forest and sea, watching the horizon for sails that never appeared. Years passed before White finally secured passage across the Atlantic. By then, 3 long years had gone by since he had last stood on the shores of Roanoke Island. The world had been consumed by war, and the colony had been left to face the wilderness alone. Chapter 4. The Silent Return. In 1590, after 3 long years trapped by war and storms, Governor John White finally secured passage back to the New World. His heart was heavy with anticipation and fear. What would he find when he returned to Roanoke Island? Would the colony he had left behind still stand, filled with life and hope? Or had the unforgiving wilderness claimed the settlers in his absence? As White's ship approached the familiar shores, a strange unease settled over him. The island looked the same from a distance. The familiar curve of the coast, the green of the forests, and the soft shimmer of the surrounding waters. Yet something felt profoundly wrong. The sails dropped anchor, and he stepped onto the sandy shore, each footstep echoing in a silence that seemed almost unnatural. He followed the narrow path toward the settlement, expecting to hear the sounds of work, of children playing, of hammers striking wood. But there was nothing. Not a single voice called out. Not a single dog barked. The wind whispered through the trees, and the only sound was the quiet lapping of waves against the shore. When White reached the fort, his heart sank. The settlement he had left behind was no longer a village bustling with life. The wooden palisade was still standing, but the houses inside were dismantled. Wooden beams lay in neat piles, tools were undisturbed, and the storage barrels remained intact. It was not the scene of chaos. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no scattered belongings. And then he saw it. Carved into the largest post of the palisade was a single word: Croatoan. The letters were clear and deliberate. White's eyes searched for a cross, the symbol the settlers had agreed upon to indicate danger or forced flight. But there was nothing. No cross. Nothing to suggest panic. For a moment, White could not believe what he saw. This was not the aftermath of attack or disaster. The colony had not been wiped out in fear. They had left methodically, carefully, and deliberately. Whoever they were, they had chosen to disappear on their own terms, leaving behind only this solitary clue. White called out, his voice cracking over the stillness. But there was no answer. He walked through the dismantled streets, touching the empty homes where families once lived, imagining Virginia Dare toddling across the floor, her laughter filling the air. He saw the simple furniture, the carved wooden chests, the remnants of daily life, all untouched, all quiet. A deep sense of grief settled over him. For years he had feared the worst, but nothing could have prepared him for this eerie reality. The colony he loved, his family among them, had vanished without a trace, leaving him with a single haunting word carved into wood: Croatoan. White's mind raced with possibilities. Had the settlers traveled to the nearby Croatoan Island, seeking safety with local tribes? Had they been absorbed into the native communities? Or had something far stranger occurred, something beyond understanding? He would never know for certain. As he stood there, surrounded by the silent remnants of a once lively colony, White realized the truth of what had happened. The people of Roanoke had vanished, not in fear or chaos, but in a deliberate, methodical way. The mystery of the lost colony remained, waiting quietly in the forests and on the wind-swept shores, a ghostly secret that America would never forget. Chapter 5. Into the Mist. What happened to the 115 settlers of Roanoke Island? Even over 4 centuries later, the question haunts historians, archaeologists, and storytellers alike. Governor John White returned to a silent colony in 1590, but the answers he sought had vanished along with the people. All that remained was the single word, Croatoan, carved into a palisade, a clue that has fueled generations of speculation. One of the most enduring theories is that the colonists joined the nearby Croatoan tribe. Perhaps in the absence of supplies and with increasing challenges to survival, the settlers sought refuge among the native peoples of the region. There is evidence that English traditions, language, and even physical features may have mingled with local tribes in the decades that followed, suggesting that some of the lost colonists may have survived, slowly blending into the land they had once sought to claim. If this is true, then the disappearance was not a tragedy, but a transformation. the colony becoming part of the living, breathing landscape of Roanoke. Another possibility casts a darker shadow. Some historians speculate that the settlers were victims of hostile forces, perhaps attacked by rival European powers, such as the Spanish, who had interests along the eastern coast. While the Spanish Armada had been defeated years earlier, tensions in the region persisted. A sudden raid could have wiped out the colony, leaving no trace. Yet the careful dismantling of the fort and the absence of violence make this explanation difficult to reconcile with the evidence. Then there is the theory of famine. Dendrochronological studies, examining the rings of ancient trees, indicate that the late 1580s were marked by severe droughts along the outer banks. Crops may have failed, and freshwater sources could have been scarce. Starvation could have forced the settlers to disperse across the land in search of sustenance. If this were the case, the colonists might not have perished all at once, but scattered, leaving behind only whispers of their existence. Some scholars even entertain the possibility of a combination of factors: integration with local tribes, small-scale deaths from disease or malnutrition, and eventual dispersal into the surrounding wilderness. Over time, any evidence of their presence would have faded, leaving only fragments of memory and legend. Whatever the truth, one fact remains clear. The colonists of Roanoke did not vanish from history entirely. Their story is etched into the land, in the forests, the beaches, and the quiet waters of North Carolina. The mystery lingers in the winds that sweep through the trees, and in the imagination of every visitor who walks the empty shores. Perhaps they did not die in the conventional sense at all. Perhaps the people of Roanoke became part of the land itself, living on in stories, in traces of culture, and in the enduring question: what became of the colony that the world could not find? In the end, the lost colony of Roanoke reminds us that history is not always neat, and that sometimes the most haunting tales are the ones that leave no definitive answers. The settlers disappeared into the mist, but their legacy, the enduring mystery, remains, whispering through the centuries, inviting us to wonder, imagine, and remember. Discover more untold mysteries of empires. Subscribe to Midnight Empire and step into history's shadows.